Today we're doing 2 chapters that have to do with Judaism. And we should always think, when we're looking at the textbook and why, where we're locating things, why we're doing this now. After we've looked at, very briefly, Native American religions and traditional African religions, and then their diaspora into the American setting, particularly the Caribbean, and then through immigration, the American setting. Why are we looking at Judaism, do you think? Why not just jump right into Protestant denominations that played a role in early colonial America? Yeah?
Well, you need to say Judaism to fully understand Christianity, where it's coming from.
It sure does help, because that Jesus guy was Jewish, and so were all those apostles, and so were most of the early Christians until it sort of spread out. So a lot of Christian concepts come out of Judaism, and some of the things actually that Protestant denominations took stands on are going to have to do with going back to biblical practices. So it makes sense to look at it that way. Any other reasons that come to mind? If we think about Native American religions and these traditional African religions and then Judaism, is there anything that they have in common? And I'm not thinking in terms of particular deities or practices. They do have some basic elements of religion in common. But is there anything else that they have in common? What about time? They're old, right? Judaism antedates Christianity. That's part of why it's very helpful to know something about Judaism to understand Christianity. And some of the basic ideas are coming through that. So it makes sense to do that. And then you notice the chapters after that, when he starts talking about Christianity, it's not going to be Protestant Christianity. Immediately he's going to start talking about the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics, because they're older branches of Christianity. So we're working at this chronologically. So it makes sense to begin with Judaism. What we're looking at the beginning is not quite the same as what we would think about as Judaism today, because there's been a lot of growth and transformation and arguments and splits and things like that have taken place. These are some basic ideas that we're going to find in most religions, basic elements, we can say. And the textbook is organized in part, the way it should be, around trying to explain these. The chapter that we're looking at right now, chapter 3, is trying to give you kind of a thumbnail sketch about basic concepts within Judaism. Chapter 4 is going to be more historical and developmental, so they kind of play off of each other. Do you have to do it that way? No. There's a lot of ways to teach this material, but I think this is a particularly good way to do it. And he starts out actually talking about this notion of commandment, or mitzvah. And we associate the notion of commandment with the notion of law, or a code. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. And, there's a given number of them, which, you can read about it. And he actually talks about the positive and the negative ones. And where do you find these? In the first 5 books of both the Christian and the Jewish Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Those are the books of the law. And you'll find a lot of thou shalt or thou shalt not. Not just the 10 commandments, but all the other ones. And traditionally, this has been understood as essential to what it meant to be a Jew. To be somebody who would follow these commandments, at least as best as you could. Some of them are, kind of tough to do. Some of them don't seem particularly relevant. If you actually, how many of you have read through these biblical books at one time or another? So those of you who do, who have, that there's a lot of commandments that probably don't seem that relevant in every situation. Like if your tent has leprosy, here's what you're supposed to do. And by that, sort of mold type of thing. Not happening all that right? But some of the commandments are really central. Thou shalt not steal. That's a biggie, right? Don't move boundary markers. What do you think that has to do with it? Don't cheat, essentially. Don't change the meanings of things. And so this is all part of Jewish life, and we're talking about several millennia of reflection on just what does this stuff actually mean for us in individual life. So he talks about orthopraxis, and orthopraxis means right living. Not just orthodoxy, which means right believing, but orthopraxis. Judaism is a lived religion. The next things that he talks about have to do with belief, and then text, and then community. He begins talking about the Shema, which is this passage from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and all thy soul, all thy might. And it goes on from there. What is this? This is an expression, a central expression of belief that is normative for Jews. You've got radical monotheism. That's one element of belief. God is one. That was a pretty radical thing to say back in ancient times. Because most systems were polytheistic. All of their neighbors were polytheistic. Now, there's historical questions of did they really start out being pure monotheists, or is that something that develops over time? At the very least, you can say this. They were connected with one deity, Yahweh. And then, over time, that becomes, very exclusive. He also talks about text. And I've already mentioned Torah. These first 5 books of the Bible that are considered to be normative. So I want to ask about who's read all 5. Who's read at least parts of the book of Exodus? Who's read parts of the book of Genesis? You should probably take a look at these. Maybe over the weekend. See what sort of stuff is in there. Is it all legal code, those of you who have read these? What else is in there? Yeah.
Like Exodus is a story about Moses and the people of Israel, moving from Egyptian rule, through the desert.
There's a lot of narrative.
Yeah.
And that narrative is understood as being centrally important. We're going to look at this a bit more in the next chapter. What else? What about in Genesis? What sort of things are happening there? You got the Adam and Eve story, right? Is that just about some guy and some girl in a garden and maybe an apple and a snake, or it could be a quince. Nobody's actually sure what kind of fruit it is. Some scholars think it's a quince. Or is it supposed to teach you something? Is it supposed to have some sort of deeper meaning?
What's a quince?
A quince is in the apple and pear family, and it's got this wonderful smell to it, almost like sweet tarts. And this is a complete digression, by the way. It's got a very astringent taste to it, even when it's ripe. So you generally have to be careful in how you cook it. But it smells wonderful. If you cook it right, it tastes wonderful.
You can't just eat it normally?
Not really. I mean, if you're hardcore, I suppose you could. But we used to grow them, so that's how I know about them. I remember giving my daughter one time, when she was little, giving her one just to see, how she'd screw up her face when I gave it to her. It's not a nice thing to do, but we just know it's, in the story it's some sort of fruit. The story's about the human condition, right? And what's the next story that follows after that? The first murder, jealousy, anger. These are dealing with very fundamental human conditions, and so the story and the legal code, they kind of go hand in hand. They're supposed to connect up with each other and illuminate each other. There's other texts that play an important role that he talks about. You might hear talk about Talmud. And Talmud is this vast proliferation of texts. This is just, I brought in a big book and a little book as sort of props. Now is the time when I'm going to bring up the big book for you. This is when he talks about the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah. This was supposed to be passed down orally from the time of Moses, and then only later on written down. And it forms part of the Talmud. It's understood as being the oral part of the law. And if you read through it, it's a lot of discussions between people about what do the laws actually mean. And you can get a sense of just how weighty it is by looking at that. I'll actually pass it around. If you can take a look at it if you want to. It's pretty dry stuff until you get into it. Along with the Mishnah in the Talmud, you have Gemara, which is commentary. People actually saying, well, what does this mean? What is this about? And so it's not just the Torah that's considered to be normative, it's also the Talmud. This reflection on what the laws mean, about what it means to be a follower of the commandments. What else should we... he talks about community. And, here we're thinking about Israel itself. And this is one of those words that can mean more than one thing, can't it? If I say Israel, what pops to your head immediately? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Oh, so yeah, that wasn't what I was expecting, but that's good. So already you're thinking in terms of several millennia ago, when there actually were 12 tribes. 10 of them got destroyed by the Assyrians and got scattered. Only 2 of them survived in Judah. What else do you think about? What's for the rest of you? What's the first thing that comes to mind? I say Israel.
Actual country. Yeah,
there's an actual portion of land that at one time the people that we at that time were called the Hebrews, also the Israelites. The ones in the south were called the Jews, the Judeans, because they were from Judea. Eventually that term comes to cover the rest of them. They lived there. That was considered to be the promised land. And there's all sorts of discussions about what exactly that means. Israel was for a while a major player in the Middle East, around, under kings like David and Solomon. You had trade routes extending all the way to Ethiopia. Then it disappeared for a long time. It became part of the Roman province of Palestine. And it's only in recent years that we can speak of a state of Israel again. What else would we think about? It also means the people, the Jewish people themselves. So it's not a term that only refers to one thing. You'd say Israel lives partly in Israel and partly in New York and partly in Baghdad and partly in, pick wherever else you like. And then you're using the term Israel in 2 different ways, aren't you? To refer to 2 connected things. What else do we have to talk about in terms of community? What do communities always have? And we'll get to ritual in a minute, so don't say rituals. Yeah.
The leader.
Yes. So the leadership in the Jewish community, your book gives you 2 important terms. Originally, you would have kings, when Israel was still a kingdom, and they played an important role. And you had prophets, and they often played an important role. Sometimes they got, thrown into wells or things like that. They weren't always on the right side of the king. And then you also had the priests in the temple, but the temple was destroyed a long time ago. There's a little portion of it left in Israel. And who became the people who exercised authority? What does your book talk about? Think about Jewish communities today. Who are,
The leaders became the rabbis.
Yeah, and this is an important transformation. Originally, rabbi means teacher. So you'll actually see in the Gospels Jesus being referred to by some people, addressing him as rabbi, meaning teacher. If you weren't worshiping in the temple, and most Jews couldn't, by the time that we're looking at the first century Common Era. Where would Jews be? They'd be scattered all over the place. Where would they go to worship? Not the temple. There was actually, by the way, more than one temple. They discovered, like, another temple at Elephantine in Egypt, which was used by Jewish mercenaries. It's very far down the Nile. Whole different conversation there. But that's not most people at that time. They would go to synagogues. And synagogues, that means a place where you gather people together. It's coming from Greek. And the Torah would be read and people would comment on it. Eventually, rabbis, when the temple is no longer there, come to take on a greater and greater role. And your book talks about some of the transformations that actually take place in America. Are there any other people who exercise important authority within Jewish communities? Traditional Jewish communities. What else does your book talk about? They bring up on page 34 the cantor, or chazzan. Cantor is a person who sings, right? So is this like, they're pop stars coming up with happy music, the next big hit? And so you give them some authority like we do with celebrities? Not exactly that, right? This is ritual singing, and bless you, it's part of the service. And if you don't have a rabbi, the cantor is somebody who actually knows the sort of order of ritual, and they end up taking on an important role as well, particularly in the absence of rabbis in early America. So they end up assuming a central role. All these things sort of reinforce each other. What really ties it together that your book talks about is ways of punctuating time with ritual. So how many different ways could we look at that, do you think? There's the year, right? The yearly cycle. So we're going to talk about some of the holidays in just a minute. Those would be examples of that. What else? What are other ways people mark time that are meaningful, that are tied in with rituals? Let's think about some secular rituals. When were you allowed to get your driver's license? Your real driver's license, not the learner's permit. 17?
16.
Where's the 17?
New Jersey.
Really? Wow. I didn't know about that. They're kind of jerks, Make you wait that long when everyone else gets to do it when they're 16. That's a coming of age thing, right? Another sort of coming of age thing that you guys will be experiencing anywhere from 1 to 3 years from now would be walking across the stage down there in the by the student center in ceremonial garb, cap and gown. It'll be pretty hot, most likely, and kind of a boring ceremony, and some of you may skip it. But that's a secular ritual, right? What is it marking? It's marking a transition from being a student to adult life as an educated person. So we've got the year. We've also got the rituals that have to do with a person's life. So we have two different dimensions, and this holds for a lot of different religions. There are two important dimensions. One is cyclical, and one you could think of as linear. So when we're thinking about cyclical ones, now let me get rid of some of this stuff. The big cycle of the year. Where do you want to put January? Up on top or the bottom? Or? It's hard to figure out exactly. It's arbitrary, isn't it, how we divide up time? Let's put it up here. So here's December, and here's January. We're using our normal calendar months, or secular months. There's two different ways in which time is parsed out. One is that every week, and I know I'm not going to get 51 or 52 in here the way I ought to, but you get the idea. What happens? We have 7 days in a week because we've adopted this 7-day way of reckoning things. Not everybody has that. Why does that matter? Particularly for Jewish life. What happens every 7 days? Yeah.
To observe the Sabbath.
Exactly. The Sabbath means seventh day. You're going to say the same thing, right? And the Jewish observance of the Sabbath is one of the central elements of orthopraxy, of doing the religion rather than just believing in the religion. You notice it's one of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, and there's supposed to be no work done, which includes things like cooking. So they'll set aside food. There's a whole bunch of different rules if you're really hardcore about this that have to do with what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. But the idea is that it's supposed to be a day of what? Being bored? Exactly. Day of what?
Rest.
Rest, yeah. And there's even sort of a, big example up in the sky for it. Even God took a break on the seventh day, so everybody should take a break. And it's also tied in with years. There's supposed to be fallow periods, 7 times 7, you have a jubilee. There's a lot involved there that your book doesn't talk about. Then there's holidays, and I'm just going to sort of put them in here randomly because I'm not going to try to be very exact, at certain points of the year where important things are going on. And he talks about just a few of these. He talks about Passover or Pasch, the Greek word for which, by the way, means Easter. That's where we get Paschal from, because Easter for Christians was actually, at the time of the Passover. And the Passover is to celebrate the liberation in Exodus. And there's food that's supposed to be eaten to remind them of what took place. There's a narrative that goes along with it to remind them of their religious identity. He talks about Rosh Hashanah, which is the beginning of the High Holy Days. And the High Holy Days are a time, in part, for reconsidering one's life, for putting things into perspective. Yom Kippur is this day of atonement. Atonement is when you try to make up for the things that you've really screwed up. Take stock of it. And a lot of New Year's rituals, by the way, in a lot of cultures, are not these, sort of bacchanalia of going out and getting drunk and maybe hooking up or something like that. They're actually more sober times of getting together and being kind of quiet and thinking about how do I unscrew up my life, my screwed up life. Because by the time that you live a while, generally your life is kind of screwed up in certain respects. And so a lot of times New Year's rituals are tied in with that. Another important holiday is Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths. And there'll be, it's also sometimes called the Feast of Tabernacles. A tabernacle means a tent. And so there'll be a tent erected, and there'll be, not everybody actually lives in the tents the whole time, because, imagine doing that here, with the weather the way it is here. But they'll put something up there and spend some time in it. And what is that commemorating? The time spent out in, the wilderness, wandering. Purim has to do with what took place in the book of Esther, one of the first sort of imperial deliverance stories, you could say. If you haven't read the book of Esther, you ought to read it. It's really funny reading in a lot of respects. It's sort of like an adventure story. This girl, there's a villain who tries to, organize a mass killing of all the Jews across the entire Persian Empire, and they are able to thwart him. And that's a commemoration of that. And then finally they talk about Hanukkah. And Hanukkah has kind of changed its orientation a bit in recent times, especially in America. What is it originally a commemoration of? Does anyone know? Why do they have the 8 candles? No one's familiar with that? It's a commemoration of an event that's supposed to have taken place during these wars that the Jews were fighting under the Maccabees. You can find this discussed in the books of the Maccabees, which are not part of the Jewish canon, but are part of the Orthodox and Roman Catholic canon of Scripture. And the Jews finally kicked these Greeks out, and there's a whole big story about why that was important. And the Greeks had desecrated the temple, and the temple was a very important holy place. So one thing that they needed to do was to actually light the lights. And nowadays we thankfully have electricity. What did they use back then for lighting?
Oil.
Very good. Yeah, it wasn't just torches like you see in the movies. It was oil, because oil is actually reliable, and will burn for a while. And so you would keep a supply of oil on hand. They only had enough for one day, and they needed enough for 8 days, and the oil never ran out. And that's what the whole thing is a commemoration of. What has it kind of turned into now? Because of the time of the year, Hanukkah falls right around here usually. What else usually falls right around here for a lot of people in our culture? Yeah.
It's like an alternative to Christmas.
Exactly. So you can get yourself a Hanukkah tree that's decorated in blue and white, and he even brings up Hanukkah Harry or Uncle Max the Hanukkah Man, which is pure fabrication, right? It's just supposed to be sort of like an equivalent to Santa Claus. And there's a lot, I'll just Google it, and you'll find a lot of comparisons between Hanukkah and Christmas. Often to the detriment of Hanukkah, because it wasn't originally designed to be, neither was Christmas actually, a massive gift-giving holiday. I think Christmas is a bit more successful in that respect in its transformation. But all of these are ways in which time is made sacred. There's one other element that I sort of skipped over that would fit in with this, and also in belief and practice. And that is having to do with food. This is something very distinctive to not only Jewish culture, but Jewish religion. Why does food matter? There are ritual laws about what can be eaten and what can't be eaten. And this has actually produced a lot of great food, because if you can't use certain ingredients and you kind of like the taste that those ingredients have, you got to find substitutes, or you got to work with what you've got and make it turn out in interesting ways. These are what we call, often the kosher laws, and they're coming from mostly stuff in like it says in Leviticus, a bit of stuff in Genesis as well. The forbidding eating blood is actually coming from the Noah story. The blood is the life. And your book talks about 3 main elements to this, avoiding pork and shellfish and a number of other animals. The Bible, by the way, would divide animals up a little bit differently than we do. That's why sometimes, this is a digression, but when people say, well, what about Catholics in Lent and not eating fish? Why are they allowed, or just not eating meat rather, but if fish is meat, why are they allowed to do that? Because if you look at the biblical stories, they classified animals into the birds of the air, right? The fish of the sea, the herd animals of the land, and then creeping things. And you weren't supposed to eat creeping things. So no snakes, no scorpions. There were some things like you could eat certain locusts, which people do in the Middle East. And birds of the air, you couldn't eat, for example, birds of prey. When it came to the animals of the land, there's rules. It has to both chew the cud and have cloven hooves. So that rules out, for example, pigs, right? Because what do pigs eat? This is a trick question. Anything. They are one of the most omnivorous creatures on earth. They're like us. They'll eat any stuff you put in front of them. So that's not the cud, right? Split hooves means there's some animals that would be ruled out that do eat grass. Can you think of any animals that don't have split hooves? But that would count. Yeah.
Would that be a camel? Camels have split hooves, but
I guess you could eat them then. I don't know. I don't know enough about camels. I was thinking of horses, but you know. Those are rules. Another major important thing, and this comes from a law saying you shall not boil a calf in its mother's milk, which probably had to do with some Canaanite rituals. It was interpreted as don't mix meat and dairy. So you could not have a kosher sausage pizza, for example. That would be impossible. And actually the dishes that you cook with meat and dairy have to be kept separate from each other. So this is part of kosher kitchens and kosher observances. The slaughter of the animals has to be done in a certain way so as to remove all the blood. So when you see kosher meat, what it's saying is that it's been slaughtered in accordance with these guidelines. And if you're an observant Jew, you would want to keep kosher. This is actually going to be a dividing line when we go to later on and look at, say, Reform Judaism as opposed to Orthodox Judaism. That'll be one big dividing line between them. The Reformed Jews celebrated one of their first get-togethers by having shrimp, which would be ruled out by the kosher laws. So that's all the stuff in chapter 3 in a very whirlwind tour.